right, Chris McClune here with Fire Apparatus and Emergency Equipment. Welcome to this episode of Water Delivery. As always, my guests are Andy Sacadato and Bill Adkins. Today, we are going to follow up on what we talked about last time. Last time, we talked about designing a pumper from scratch to be a water delivery piece of apparatus. We got into pump design. We talked about intakes. We talked about discharges. We talked about the water you need to really make it something that can move tremendous volumes of water. This time, we're going to talk about that reserve piece that you might have sitting there. Maybe it could be just a reserve piece that doesn't get used a lot because because your fleet is in really good shape. Could be a reserve piece that may be in the line of reserve pieces. It's, toward that in that list, it's toward the bottom. And so you're thinking about maybe doing something different with it, repurposing it. We're not talking about really doing, I don't think, we'll find out in a minute. I don't think we're talking about doing a tremendous amount to it in order to make it a water supply piece. But we may find out that I'm wrong on that. But that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to be talking about a reserve piece of apparatus and taking that, and what are the things that you need to consider if you are going to make a reserve piece, for lack of a better term, your pipeline piece, or your, really make it so that its main purpose in life is to be a water supply piece, not at high volumes, not necessarily just a reserve engine now that's going to be doing firefighting. So again, guys, thanks for jumping into this with me today. To start us off, I think before we even talk about what you have to do to change these things around, maybe, is what do you need to be thinking about? So you got the thing sitting there. You need to decide if it's even a viable idea to take this reserve piece to make it a water supply piece. Bill, I'll start with you this time. What are some of the things you need to be looking at? You got the pumper in front of you. What do you need to be thinking about to decide whether it's even a viable idea to change it over?
Yeah, thanks, Chris. One of the things that I look at when I'm getting ready to take an older piece to make it anything is how much maintenance is it going to be as much needed? Is it going to be worth, putting money into it? If it needs a lot of work done to it, it may not be worth, putting that piece of apparatus back into service or moving along with something else. Something else we need to consider is, has it been tested annually like it's supposed to be per NFPA? Pump testing and ladder testing is something that you need to consider anytime you put a piece of apparatus in service. We need to make sure it is been tested and able to do the job. So how much money is it going to take for us to put that piece of apparatus in service is one of the big considerations that we look at. Is it cheaper to buy another old piece of apparatus if you don't have the funds to buy a brand new apparatus? It may be cheaper to look online to find a used apparatus to do what you're wanting it to do, instead of the maintenance that this particular apparatus may need. A lot of times you find out that even if it does need some maintenance to it, it's still a lot cheaper than buying another apparatus.
Andy?
Yeah, so I agree 100% with what Bill said, right? Is the juice worth the squeeze with regards to the maintenance, or do we just have a rig that really needs to be, set out to pasture? But one of the other things that we talked about in the other discussion when we were talking about, new trucks, I think it's really important personally to make sure that you identify what the mission of the rig is, right? So I know that kind of sounds broad, like we know it's maybe going to be a water supply piece, but is it going to be a water supply piece for mainly a rural organization? Is it going to be a water supply piece that is going to be doing a lot of relay pumping operations? Because that really kind of potentially changes what is already there, whether or not it's going to be capable of doing it efficiently, effectively, or if we need to go something else, right? But with regards to the maintenance and the apparatus testing and certification, I couldn't agree more. That needs to definitely be something that's on the forefront. And you need to determine, is this thing, depending on its age, is it roadworthy? Is it safe to be driving in an emergency condition, and everything like that? Not to mention, and I know, some fire departments aren't as fortunate, but we would be remiss not to mention that, according to the NFPA standard, there is a point in time where you should be retiring apparatus. So, how old is this rig? Is it, an engine that has been in service for 10 years and now is going to go into that reserve status? Or is it an engine that's been, in service for 20 years and we're thinking about, using it for something else? The standard says that rigs that are over 25 years old should technically be retired from service. So that's all great and fine, but not everybody has that ability to follow that standard. So if you're running, whether it be a frontline piece or we're taking a reserve rig or older rig and turning it into a water supply piece, if the rig is over 25 years old, making sure that this maintenance and pump testing and everything, making sure that the rig is roadworthy is even more important, I think.
Is there anything in NFPA 1900 specifically, or that you're aware of specifically about a rig designed for water supply, or is it just a pumper?
To my knowledge, I have to look in the standard, but to my knowledge, water supply apparatus specialty pumpers are not highlighted in their own chapter. Pumpers are, but specialty pieces like a water supply pumper is not. And it's I remember taking Chief Peters' class a couple years ago at FDIC. He brought up a really good point, and it's something that I didn't even realize at the time. A common misconception with regards to NFPA standards and a very common piece of equipment that we see in the American Fire Service is the pumper tanker. Technically, there's no column or chapter, at least in the old 1901 standard, that says this is what a pumper tanker is. Those are two different chapters. There are pumpers, and then there are mobile water supply pieces. And, Chief brought up a really good point, and something that, man, I would really hate to be in a position to have to explain this one. He brought the point up of, listen, you need to make sure you identify which part of that standard you want to follow. Do you want credit for it to be a mobile water supply piece? Do you want credit for it to be a pumper? And depending on what your ISO needs are, well, if you don't meet the right column, you may not get any points. That would be a really bad day to explain to your stakeholders as to why you spent that kind of money on a rig that doesn't give you any ISO points.
Yeah, when we purchased our pumper tanker at Fayetteville, we made sure that it met the pumper standards first, and then because it flowed, or because it carried the 3,000 gallons of water, and we made sure that the dump was able to dump on all three sides, that it was going to meet the tanker standard as well. But start off with that pumper, because you need all that hose and the equipment that's needed for it to meet that pumper standard.
Besides the maintenance aspect of it, is there anything that immediately kind of like disqualifies a rig to be considered to be reconsidered as if it wasn't originally designed with maximum water supply in mind? Is there anything that immediately you disqualify it immediately when you're looking to change that mission of the reserve piece? Is there anything like right off the bat, nope, not going to work? Andy?
I would say one of the major things would potentially be plumbing and pump size. That's really important. Now, that's not to say in our last conversation we discussed, when I'm building a new rig, ideally I want a 2,000 gallon per minute pump, but I might be dealing with a 30-year-old engine that still has usable life left, but back in the early 90s. or before, 2,000 gallon per minute pumps weren't necessarily something that you were going to see a lot. So in those situations, right, if we're talking about a pumper that has a 1250 or 1500 GPM, I wouldn't say that necessarily disqualifies it, but just understand that it's not going to be as efficient for moving those large volumes. I would say on the discharge plumbing side, again, not necessarily a fast disqualification, but an older rig that doesn't potentially have large diameter discharges, that's going to be you're going to be a little bit behind the 8 ball if I'm trying to build a water supply support piece, because it's going to require me to do multiple medium diameter hoses going into a manifold or a Siamese or something like that just to supply 4 or 5 inch. So I'm not saying that it's not possible. It's just going to be more work. So that's one thing. But I think personally, the one thing that would automatically, in my mind, kind of disqualify the rig from being an option is if it doesn't have a sufficient number of intakes, right? If it can't get water into the pump, right, it really is not going to be great serving as a water supply support piece. And with that, we've talked a bunch on this podcast about intake valves and the importance of intake valves. And those can be switched, but making sure that this rig, if it is 25 or 30 years old, has appropriately sized intake valves, that's really important as well.
Bill, how about you? Anything that you would look at right away and be like, nope, not going to happen?
Oh, Andy hit it on the head when he said pump capacity. If it's going to be for that, large volumes of water, we need, and in my case, royally speaking, I usually will set it at 1,000 gallons a minute. If it's less than 1,000 gallons a minute, it is just not made for that type of operation. And I use that 1,000 gallons a minute because based on most of your tankers out there to refill, and that should, we want it to be at that 1,000 gallons a minute range. If I need more than 1,000 gallons a minute, there's always another piece of apparatus on scene that we can have push up to the scene as well. I'm not opposed to using multiple pieces of apparatus to get to the fire scene if that's what's needed. But that 1,000 gallons a minute is my threshold of that's disqualification if it's not there.
It almost seems like, these days, when we think about doing this, when we look 10 years, even 20 years down the line, when we're looking back at most trucks that have those 2,000 gallon a minute pumps, it's actually going to be a lot easier to have this conversation about doing it. But that kind of makes me think, like, as of today, is it even worth it? Is it even worth considering right now, or should we just put these rigs, out the pasture because of some of these? And we're going to get into things that you can do to convert them in a minute, but because of some of these things that kind of make us go like, this just isn't going to happen. Is it worth considering, Andy?
I think so, and mainly because in certain instances, maybe you have a rig that like Bill's saying, maybe it's only got that 1,000 gallon per minute pump, right? So I know it's not going to be the best rig to potentially pump large volumes for long durations, but the rig could still serve. And one of the things that a lot of people forget, or something that comes up at least in the classes that I teach, and I'm sure Bill comes across it too, is one thing that folks tend to forget is that in order to do rural water supply or even large volume hydrant operations, any type of more complex water supply operation, it requires ancillary equipment, right? It requires hose, it requires strainers, it requires hard sleeves, it requires manifolds and appliances. So even if I have a rig that, maybe it doesn't have the best pump, right? Maybe the pump it's not something that I want to do some really big relay pumping or some source pumping or anything like that. But the rig is chocked full of equipment that other units that are going to be on the scene can use, and actually rigs that have better pumping capabilities can actually implement. To me, I still think that's advantageous. And one of the things that I think people should look at if you're looking at implementing one of these is what is the hose bed configuration on the rig that you're looking to convert into this water supply piece, because it may need to be we need to take a different mindset from an attack engine where I want to be able to have a lot of attack lines off the rear, this, that, and the other. I need a hose bed that can carry a lot of supply, or I need a hose bed that maybe instead of the 20-foot of hard sleeve that the rig was carrying when it was in frontline service, well, now I need to find room to put 60 feet of sleeve on there. Maybe the hose bed is a good option for that, right? So I think that this is a good option for areas where that we need a water supply support piece, whether we want to implement purchasing a trailer or a pickup with a body on it or something like that. Or, we can take that old reserve that is just sitting in the back of the firehouse. Yeah, it hasn't passed pump test. It doesn't have a good pump, or it has a small pump, but we can load all this equipment onto the rig and we can use it in another way, right? If nothing else, to be like back in the day, a hose wagon, right? If nothing else, that can still help us from a water supply perspective, in my opinion.
Bill?
Yeah, I believe it's worth it as well if you can. It's like I mentioned earlier, it's a lot cheaper than buying a new apparatus. And we got to remember, most of our fires, we're not flowing over 1,000 gallons a minute. I know we're talking about water movement and water delivery stuff here today, but these are not your everyday fires that we're dealing with here. So when you have a piece of apparatus sitting in your bay that you can use, and it takes just a few hundred or even a couple $1,000s to get it in service to do what you need it to do, it's well worth that to take that time. Because if money's not an issue, heck yeah, go buy you a brand new apparatus and get what you want. But with the departments that I usually deal with, and I'm sure Andy does too, they don't have the funds in their checking account or their bank account to go buy a piece of new apparatus. You have something sitting in your bay, it's much worth it to go ahead and put that back in service if possible.
And something I want to add real quick to that is, like Bill was saying, one of the things I can speak for myself, but in my opinion, and Bill, chime in if you have a different opinion. In my opinion, I don't necessarily think that this is something that every single fire department needs, right? Not every single fire department needs a specialty water supply piece. And depending on your makeup in your area and everything like that, this may be easier to do than in some other places. But maybe if you can look at regionally, right? Hey, in this county, in Bedford County, we know we have this older rig, but it's still got some useful life. We're going to turn it into the county water supply piece, right? And it gets assigned everywhere in the county to do whatever. Now it may require breaking down some walls between organizations and stuff like that, but it really is in everybody's best interest if you can do that. And by no means, I really hope that the viewers and the listeners aren't thinking that we're saying that, if you have a reserve, that really you got to turn it into a water supply piece. No, right? Some places just need a reserve to fill in as an attack engine or whatever when the primary engine goes down.
I'd like to add to that as well, Andy.
Yeah.
Whenever we go to buy a piece of apparatus at Fayetteville, because we don't have the funds to buy anything and everything we want, I always take a look at what my neighboring departments have. About 4 years ago, we bought an aerial at Fayetteville, and at the time, no other department neighboring to us had an aerial, so we wanted that aerial for those occasions. Well, as soon as we bought it, the years after, we've got 3 aerials neighboring to us now. If that would have happened back, if we didn't known that was going to happen, we wouldn't have bought the aerial in the first place, because we knew we had neighboring departments that could bring an aerial if we needed it. So that's something I always consider. If there is an apparatus next door to you guys, then you don't need to put that reserve back into service to do that water delivery,
For sure, that's a key point. Like I said, we've gone through how to build one from scratch. If you need one and you have the reserve and you want to do it, that's what we're talking about today. And I think that kind of leads us into more along the lines of, we talked a lot about, why wouldn't you? Or what is it about the truck that would lead you to not? But now I want to get into a little bit more about what we would do to actually do it. And one of the things I thought was worth mentioning was, we touched on it last time as well, but I just wanted to go over it again. The pump size. We talked about, you could have a pump that is just not going to cut it. But we also know, and I just wanted to go over how this happens again, how this works. We also know that we can get often 2,000 gallons a minute out of a pump that is rated at 1,500. And you could probably go down to one that's 1,250 and maybe get upwards of 1,500 out of that. If that's what you want to do. You might not be able to get up to 2,000. My thing is always, and what I always hear in the back of my mind is a chief engineer from a different fire company, one that we run with all the time. But we were having some water supply class, and he was like, well, you can do anything if you got the water. So, I mean, there is that aspect of it as well to get. But could you just go through with me, Andy, how we get 2,000 gallons a minute, for example, out of a 1,500 gallon a minute pump?
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's important to reiterate and make sure that everybody understands that we're talking about these pump ratings. They're under very specific conditions, right? They're when the apparatus is operating from a static source. So that's really important. Depending on the pump rating when it's new, there's a maximum number of intakes that can be used on the truck. There's a maximum amount of lift that can be present, and there is a specified suction hose diameter that has to be used. So for 2,000 gallon per minute rated pumpers, what that really means is that rig can flow 2,000 gallons per minute when it is using 2 intakes with 2 20-foot sections of hard sleeve, so 20 foot on this side, 20 foot on that side, going into the water source with no more than 6 feet of lift, okay? And it has to do that at a pump discharge pressure of 150 PSI, okay? When the pump discharge pressure bumps up to 200 PSI, you're only going to get 70% of the capacity. When it goes to 250, you're only going to get 50% of the capacity. So with all that being said, right, it's important to understand that there are 3 major variables that dictate pump capacity when we're talking about a rig's ability to deliver volume. The first is obviously the pump size, the size of that impeller. So if I have a 1250 GPM pump, all right, I'm sitting here saying, well, that's all I'm going to be able to get. It's important to understand that the other 2 variables can potentially positively influence my ability to flow more than that. So the other 2 variables are the number of discharges present on the rig. So each 2.5-inch discharge on a pumper accounts for 250 gallons a minute of the pump capacity. Larger plumbing can give you more, and that's all listed in the standard. But the more discharges I have, the more ability to get rid of the water, right? And then the third variable is the horsepower of the vehicle's motor. So if I have a large enough motor that is capable of turning that impeller and getting rid of that water, right, I could very well exceed the pump's rated capacity. So the biggest thing that we like to teach our students is, regardless of what you're dealing with, right, yeah, I can squeeze out a little bit more volume out of a pumper regardless of what its original rating is, if I understand that the first step is to get a lot of water into it. So for example, a 1,500 gallon per minute pumper and smaller, right? So thousands, 1250s, they have to be able to get their rating when they are using no more than 1 intake with 6-inch hard sleeve. Okay, that's what they have to be able to do when they're getting certified and all that. In the field, there's nothing that says that I can't put 2 intakes into the water off that 1250 pump. And what that does is it allows more volume to get into the rig. So now it's happy. It can breathe. It can get the water in. Okay. Well, now if I got the water coming in, and I use multiple discharges on that 1250 pumper, well, now I can get the water out. There's less friction in the plumbing as a whole because I'm splitting the total flow between multiple discharges, and it's easy to go out, right? And then if I understand that the higher the pressure that I require, the lower the flow is going to be. So if I set out my hose operation and my supply operation using large diameter hose, multiple supply lines, a lot of hose on the ground going to feed something else, well, the pump pressures aren't going to have to be very high. So the rig can deliver the high volume at a low pressure. Okay. If I use all three of that together, yeah, I can get more water out of a 1250 pump than, what it's rated at 150 PSI, right? So that's the best way to understand this. Now, that very well may mean and may not be feasible, or a lot of people think that when we're using a water supply piece, we're going to be drafting out of a source or whatever it may be, and then having that pumper pump through, 2,000 foot of 5-inch to the fire scene. Well, maybe if I have that pumper at the source, first of all, maybe it'd be more beneficial to put a larger pump at the source. But if you can't, then I get it. But I might have to put relay pumpers or shorten it up or put multiple supply lines down, whatever I need to do to get that master pump pressure lower so I can get the volume out.
It sounds like really, and the main reason I brought that up is just so that should anyone be considering doing something like this, it is possible. Don't be turned off right away by the rated capacity of your pump when you bought it. Because we can get more out of it. I thought it was worth reviewing that one more time. So now we figured out that we can do it. We've looked at it, maintenance wise. Okay, we're good there. The pump, we've done some testing. We know we can get what we want out of it. Are there any types of modifications that need to be made to a rig that, we'll take 20 years old, which bothers me because that was only 2005. And that really just, sheds light on just, how far along I am. But just 20 years old, probably has a 2000 GPM pump. So we're sitting here, we're looking at something that can be done. Are there any modifications that need to be made? Andy, you kind of touched on one before when you started talking about the hose bed. But beyond that, are there other modifications that you think would need to be made to a truck to make it so that its main purpose in life is moving a lot of water?
As far as modifications, one of the things I would look at is with an older rig, it may be plumbed with, get in behind the pump panel there and look at the plumbing. It may have, a lot of the older rigs will have 2.5-inch discharges, and something we may be able to get a mechanic to put in some larger or more straight plumbing, even if you have to do some cutting along that pump panel to make those discharges come out. Adding a larger diameter discharge to your pump would be a modification I would look into. Also, a lot of modifications that, not necessarily modifications, but the maintenance part of it is the valves. Overhauling the valves is a modification that you definitely want to, if a rig's been sitting in your bay for a long period of time, the valves probably hasn't been worked in a while and they need to be modified as well, whether it be a new valve or just overhauling them.
Well, with the valve too, I think NFPA now if it's only 20 years old, it's probably okay, but it needs to be for any large diameter discharge, right? It needs to be a slow opening valve. Is that correct? So, depending on the age of the truck, once you put the large diameter discharge on there, you might have to change the valve over completely. I don't know. Well, is that only if the pipe is large diameter? So if it's a 2.5-inch discharge that you've put an adapter on with a 5-inch Storz, does that still count? Does that have to be a slow opener?
That doesn't count. Okay. But even if you have a competent mechanic, they can add a large diameter discharge to your pump casing. If you open up a lot of those pump panels that have the 2.5 inch discharges, it actually has a 4-inch discharge to it. It's just reduced down to that 2.5, and that's what comes outside the pump panel. We can take that off and add a complete 4-inch discharge to it as well.
And then the new valve.
And a new valve, yes.
Andy, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, not to give a roundabout answer, but it's all in how much money you want to spend, right? If you want to spend a decent amount of money and redo the plumbing, absolutely, that's the best thing to do. And again, like Bill's already said, that's going to be cheaper than buying a new rig, right? But something else to think about is, for rigs that maybe only have one large diameter discharge, right? Or if you're dealing with a rig that has no large diameter discharges for whatever reason, right? If you're building a water supply piece, the rig has to be able to supply LDH. And in my opinion, it has to be able to supply multiple large diameter discharges if it's going to be a supply piece. So having something in your head or having a way to do that is really important. Bill touched on, changing plumbing to support and be able to do a large diameter discharge or larger plumbing for a true large diameter discharge. Right. Another option is to do a manifold, right? So meaning get a separate manifold that you carry on the apparatus and you put on the ground, and then you use multiple 2.5 inch discharges with 2.5 or 3 inch hose going into that manifold. And then on the outlet side, going to wherever is where you're going to attach your 4 or 5 inch, right? So that's how I can supply a large diameter hose or multiple large diameter hoses with a rig that maybe doesn't have a large diameter discharge. Chris, you brought up, putting an adapter and going 2.5 to 4 or 5 inch, whatever storage you're using. That, in my opinion, if you're going to be building this rig to be a water supply piece, that should be the last option, because essentially what you're trying to do is you're trying to jam a large diameter flow rate into a discharge that only has to be able to flow 250 gallons a minute, right? But when I split that flow up between multiple 2.5 inch discharges going into a single supply line going down the down range, that is much more efficient. So with rigs, your example was a rig that's 2005. So odds are it probably has a large diameter discharge, at least one. So what I would do if that's my rig and I'm turning it into a supply piece is, okay, I can get the first large or LDH supply line supplied with the LDH discharge. If I got to supply a second, I'm going to do the manifold operation off of 3 or 4 2.5 inch discharges feeding it.
So I want to discharges seems to, that's what I keep hearing in my head here is the more you guys talk, it's like going back to one of those early questions is if you don't have the discharges, you're dead in the water. So so that's actually one of the things that we need to really think about the minute that we start considering a truck like this. I did want to throw out there, one of the reasons I brought up the last podcast and this one is because there seems to be not. I'm talking about my general geographic area. I don't know if it's fire service wide, but there is a lot of emphasis by departments, probably on the suburban side, maybe the volunteer side, where there was a time when we were just going full bore. Let's get this new truck to do everything we could possibly think of to do without putting an aerial on top. And so now there does seem to be getting back, and my fire company has had some rigs with a lot of discharges, because our chief was like, we want this in front of the building, no matter where it's going, we're going to get it in the front because we're going to have all these options to flow water. But in recent years, I'd say within the last 5 to 10, there does seem to be an emphasis on building, firefighting engines again. So you're not they're being designed more, on the suburban and the urban side. I'll keep rural out of that one because that's a somewhat different universe there. But the shorter wheelbase, the lower hose beds, some of them they're not coming with cross lays anymore. Everything's coming off the back. There's a lot of fire attack mentality in mind there, where suddenly, and it could be a money saver, it could be anything else. You don't have as many large diameter discharges as maybe some of the rigs in the 90s and early 2000s did. So that's one of the things I had in mind when I was thinking, okay, if we're going to build one of these from scratch, here's what we do. If we're going to modify something, this would be a way to do it, because I'm not talking about building like the super pumper in New York kind of a deal, but there are going to be times, depending on, there are McMansions popping up everywhere, whether it's rural or urban or suburban. So that was kind of where I was going with a lot of these things. But I'll tell you what, discharges, man. I keep hearing you guys say discharges. So I wanted to talk a little bit about maintenance. Bill, you brought up maintenance in the beginning, but what I'd like to talk a little bit more about now is, and you said it, like these older trucks, they require more maintenance. The older truck gets, the more frequently it is going to require maintenance. But there are preventive maintenance things that we would need to be doing as well, especially these trucks are getting older. So what are some of the preventive maintenance items that become even more important if we're converting a truck into a more of a water supply piece and it's a little older?
Yeah, two things come to mind when it comes to maintenance on these older rigs. Besides the engine itself, that's even the new apparatus needs that maintenance on the engines. But when it comes to the pump packing and the pump's valves, like I mentioned before, if an apparatus has been sitting in your bay for a while, there's a good chance that your packing is dry and not sealed very well, and your valves have probably not been worked, so they're going to need a good overhaul. And those are two things that can help you move a lot of water quickly. If you have a problem with your apparatus not established in a draft from a static water source, most likely your pump packing is what's holding you back. If you got a nice tight packing, it doesn't take a lot of effort to create that draft, especially when you're out of water. Now, I'm not talking about using a burp draft method or a jet siphoning. We're dry, we have no water left in our tank, and we need to use the primer to establish that draft. We need a good pump packing so that pump is nice and tight to get that draft nice and easy. And speaking of that, the primer is another thing you want to make sure you're doing a good maintenance on that, because if it's been sitting there, those primers, most of the primers except the air primers, which is a new item, but the old primers were water lubricated. Well, if you haven't been running water through it in a long time, most likely those impellers are froze up. So you'll need to get in there and overhaul that impeller.
Andy, any preventive maintenance items for you?
Bill hit the big ones, right? That packing is very important, especially if it's going to be a water supply piece. But something else that may be worth looking at is pay attention to the gauges, right, on the pump panel. So make sure that they're not only are they calibrated, but look at the gauge graduation, right? Do I necessarily need a 0 to 600 PSI gauge on the individual discharge lines? Probably not. And if it's in your budget, then maybe replace those gauges with something a little bit more accurate and with a scale that's a little bit more realistic for what you're going to be doing. Older rigs, that was a very common practice. Even now, some rigs are coming with 0 to 600 PSI gauges, right? Kind of not really something that we need. Our pump pressures don't get that high. And really the only reason most of the time that you see a 0 to 600 PSI gauge is so that way at the factory, when they're doing the hydrostatic test pressure at 500 PSI, they don't got to switch gauges out at the pump panel, right? Or disconnect anything. Everything's good. So it makes it easy for that pump test when the truck was new. I need it to be easy for me to read and accurate for me to read when I'm actually on a fire ground, right? And then the only other thing going along with valves, we kind of mentioned it already, but depending on the age of the truck, right? Just equally as important as you said, Chris, the discharges, having enough discharges to get rid of water. I need to have intakes that can allow it to come into the pump. If I can't get it into the pump, then I can't get it out of the pump. So with that being said, your rig may have an intake valve. It may have an external intake valve that is 20, 30 years old as well. It might be time to replace that with something newer that is going to give you full opening and actually prevent any restriction coming into the pump. Again, not so much a preventative maintenance thing, more of an upgrade, but that is something that, in my opinion, is a must-have upgrade.
One of the things we haven't talked about, and maybe on purpose, because I don't know if you guys like them or not. I know on my end, I always kind of learned that they weren't always accurate in terms of what you're actually flowing, but flow meters. I get we want to make sure that they're calibrated too as well, and we want to make sure that wherever the pickup is for that is in the right spot, so that we have as accurate a reading as we can get. Like I said, I mean, I can remember taking one of our pumpers to a pump class, and we were supplying an aerial, and what we were seeing at the flow meter was not what was actually happening up at the end there. So how I mean, do you guys like flow meters? You haven't brought them up at all, so maybe you guys are both anti, and you just figure, hey, if we don't bring them up, nobody will ask. But and then how frequently do they need to be calibrated in your experience? Either one of you can take that one.
Go ahead, Andy.
Go ahead, Bill.
I do like flow meters, but I find that they are very inaccurate. We usually will do our flow metering before the apparatus is in service. So we put an inline flow meter on our intakes, and then we will flow different lines off of the apparatus to find out what we're really flowing that's been calibrated. I don't trust the flow meters that are on the fire trucks, because how often do we get them calibrated? Hardly ever. But we usually will know what each discharge will give us based off the pressure that we're set before we put that apparatus in service. So on the scene, we don't really pay attention to the flow meter so much.
Now, this question could get me into a tremendous amount of trouble, but how often do you guys actually see these kinds of things in your travels when you're going around training people? Is this something that people do, or are we suggesting something that's just totally out of whack with what fire departments are doing? Do you see it very often?
Go ahead, Bill.
Now, royally speaking, I don't see reserve engines coming back into play, but I do see a lot of older apparatus. I'm sure Andy does too, where he's from. I do see a lot of these older apparatuses when I'm going to train at these different departments, because they don't have the funds to purchase brand new apparatus every 5 or 10 years. So I do see a lot of old apparatus. It may not necessarily have been a reserve. Most of the departments, when they have an apparatus in their bay, they're using it.
How about you, Andy? Do you come across many departments that have repurposed an older truck as a water supply piece?
Some, it's few and far between. But like Bill said, if they have a rig in their firehouse, it's running it's running first out, or it's their second due piece, right? So there are departments that are doing this, but what is important to understand is there are some fire departments that are already doing this, and they don't even realize they're doing this. Whether they're running, some places call it a wagon, a second out piece, right? So whether it's like in the last discussion that we talked about, or last podcast we did, where we're speccing a new one from scratch and building it to be what we want, or we're taking an older rig and it's running as our second due piece. Well, if you have an assigned second due pumper in your firehouse, well, that's a water supply piece. I mean, really and truly, that's really what it's going to be doing. It's more than likely on a fire ground. its responsibility is going to be water supply. So whether that mean pumping a 5-alarm fire or, just establishing a dump site to supply the attack engine while they're fighting with 2 hand lines, that's a water supply piece. So you can use what we're talking about in both of these podcasts to better outfit, whether it's a rig that you're trying to build to be a water supply piece or a second out piece, or you got one already and, hey, you know what? Rather than carrying only 20 foot of hard sleeve on our rural water supply piece, maybe we can find room for 40 feet, right? Or maybe we should up the supply bed instead of 1,000 foot. Maybe we should carry 1,400 foot or whatever it may be. And understanding that, hey, you know what? This rig does have a little bit of extra space on it that we're not using. That would be good for a manifold or a 4-way valve or a separator or strainer or whatever it may be.
Do you guys, if a department was to do this, is it more of kind of like a stopgap until a newer rig can be ordered and you can move down another reserve that might be more appropriate for it? Or so is it more of a short-term solution, or would you consider this to be more long-term? I guess it's one of those. It depends. How about that, Bill?
Yeah, I would recommend it to be short-term. If we're talking about a reserve engine coming into play, it would be something I would recommend as short-term. And I'm sure the manufacturers that are watching this video would say so as well. There's just enough for them to save up the money to buy the next rig that they may need, whether it be a used rig that's slightly newer than the one that they have, or even a brand new rig.
Andy, how about you?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's more appropriate as a short-term solution, whether it, in a regional-based scenario where, hey, we know we need this piece, we need a water supply piece that can go countywide or however your jurisdiction works, but I can't afford to buy a brand new piece right now. We can take a rig from 12s and put it over here and make it a water supply piece. Until I can either as a fire chief, convince the stakeholders, hey, I need to purchase a dedicated piece to serve this role, or that rig, lasts its useful lifespan, and then we just do it again with another older rig, and we always rotate. Maybe the last stop before you go out to pasture is you're going to serve as our water supply piece, and then we're going to rotate you out. So
that makes sense. Put it into that overall replacement cycle, and change it as you go.
Especially for departments that are building rigs fairly standard spec wise, right? So it doesn't matter if I'm using engine 8 or engine 18, right? At some point, their rigs are pretty much the same. It's just now it's going to be in the water supply slot.
Gotcha. Well, originally I was going to ask you guys for a top 5 things needed to turn a reserve piece into a water supply pumper, but now that I've rethought that since we've been talking, that might not be fair. So, but to wrap us up, Bill, why don't you start me off with your top 3 things you think should be done to turn a reserve piece into a water supply pumper?
All right, Chris. Yeah, I do have the top 5. I'm not sure if you want the.
Well, if you want to go 5, go 5.
If we're talking about an apparatus that's supplying water to the fire scene, it's a high flow floating strainer. And what I use for a high flow floating strainer is that barrel strainer with an empty foam bucket, tied onto it. Try to make the string around roughly 24 inches in length. Also a high flow, low profile strainer. Remember, if our strainer is the weakest link in our system, we can't even flow that 1,000 gallons a minute if you have a strainer that's only capable of flowing 700 gallons a minute. So do your homework, get those high flow, low profile strainers. Intakes, high flow intakes as well. Not all intake valves are are created equal. So and multiple of those. And then my last thing, pump packing. This isn't. I mentioned before with the maintenance piece, is the pump packing needs to be pristine and ready to go to help you get that water established. and then fittings. If it's a water supply apparatus, that means we may be supplying multiple mutual aid companies, and they may have different fittings than what you use. Most of our apparatus, it's the first compartment on the driver's side is the engineer's compartment that has a lot of fittings. If this apparatus is going to be set up for water supply, then that whole driver's side could be filled with fittings that you may need. You don't want to need it. You don't want to try and find out that you need it on the fire scene. You want it before. You want to know that before. And if it happens to be the first apparatus on the scene, we know that most of our fires are done. The equipment really needed is forcible entry tools, hooks, ladders, and hose. The rest of it can come from other apparatus.
All right, Andy, you're up. 3 or 5, doesn't matter to me, whatever you got.
All right. So I think, and I've mentioned it before, Bill has too, intakes, right? Intakes are critical. I need to have an intake valve, okay? And I need to have a high flow intake valve on this piece, because if I can't get the water in, I can't do anything else, right? So making sure that I have the appropriately sized intake valves on our rig to be able to receive water. Another thing that I think is really, really important to be a true water supply piece is Siamese or manifolds, right? To be able to, like we said, take multiple discharges off of my pumper, go into something to then send it down a large diameter supply line to actually feed something. Whether I'm doing a parallel supply line or a more advanced fill operation, whatever, I can use these things a lot of different ways. Hose is really important, obviously. If you're going to have a supply pumper, it has to have a nice complement of supply hose, all right? Obviously, it should have some attack line just in case. But in my mind, this rig is hose-wise going to be more heavy on the supply. So we're going to be carrying a lot of large diameter hose for either long lays or being able to put multiple lines in service. I may very well be setting my hose bed up to have a split bed, so I can either lay dual 4s or dual 5s at the same time for those larger flow incidents or whatever it may require. I want medium diameter hose, a lot of medium diameter hose to be able to supply a lot of different things. So the hose complement is going to be even more heavy on, the supply hose as opposed to attack hose. Okay. And then with that, not only do I want, hose, obviously in the hose bed, but I want pony length, short little 25s, 50s. I want a lot of them. So that way I can do a lot of different things, whether it's turbo drafts, whether it's, hooking to a hydrant, heavy hooking a hydrant with multiple short lengths, whether it's just feeding somebody else, whatever, right? It gives me options. If I'm dealing with a rural pumper, a rural pumper absolutely, in my opinion, has to have this. But I would still say that it's a must-have for even an urban pumper, hard sleeve. Right? You got to have hard sleeve on the rig and more than just 20 feet. Because if I'm building a supply pumper, really, at the end of the day, this rig has to be able to operate at its, most primal fashion, which for a pumper is drafting. That is the most primal thing that a pumper will ever do is drafting. Okay. So whether I'm in New York City or in Bedford County, Tennessee, I need to be able to operate from a static source, and I need hard sleeve in order to do that. And then to kind of piggyback on what Bill said, a well-maintained pump, right? Making sure that the pump packing is good, the valves are good. I don't have a ragged out pump that isn't really good. It's going to give me more problems than it is, solutions on the fire scene.
All right, perfect, guys. Well, I think we covered quite a bit today. I'm not sure we could take this topic any farther, but thank you both very much for coming on again. I do think it's important that, as you guys have made very clear, not everyone has the resources to run out and buy a truck like this. So you may be in a position where you have a reserve that you can sort of retrofit into something. And like Andy said a little while ago, if you're a 3-unit house where you got, in my case, I got a pumper, a rescue, and a pumper. That second pumper is likely going to be involved in some kind of water supply operation. So you may already actually have one of these right in the house right now, and you don't even know it. So my thanks to you guys again for joining me on that. If there are any topics that you'd like us to tackle here, let me know. I'm at chris.mcclune@clarionevents.com. It doesn't only have to be for water delivery. It could be for any aspect of apparatus operations, speccing, equipping, or anything of the like. Also, if you would like to see any of our previous podcasts, we mentioned the one immediately previous to this one many times today, but all of them are archived at www.fireapparatus.com/podcast. So again, this has been Chris McClune along with Andy Sacadato and Bill Atkins. Have a good one, everyone, and stay safe. Thanks again, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.